All right, Merry Christmas. Yes, I've been waiting since Labor Day to say that. Today we're starting a new series, a Christmas series called A Christmas Story. How many of you have seen the movie A Christmas Story? If not, what's wrong with you? If you haven't, then it's running 24 hours a day up until Christmas, so you can catch it any hour of the night, really. And if you have HBO Max, you can see the sequel, which is 40 years in the making. I don't have that, so you can tell me how that is. But I was reading an article in Vanity Fair about this movie, and it talks about how this it was a super low-budget movie, as you can probably tell, and how it became this American tradition, surpassing classics like It's a Wonderful Life and Miracle on 34th Street. The article said that the reason A Christmas Story became the quintessential holiday movie is because it acknowledged the disappointments, the hurt feelings, and the all-around bad luck that in reality often define Christmas for most of us. In other words, it's what real Christmas is like in real families, and we just connect to that. We can't quite relate to George Bailey and his guardian angel, Clarence Oddbody, which is a great last name for an angel, I think. But we can all relate to Ralphie, because we all have a story like that, like the Christmas where, we got the thing we wanted and we were waiting and waiting and waiting. We didn't know what was going to happen on a Christmas morning. There it is. Or another story of the most disappointing Christmas where you got nothing but socks and underwear, right? Anybody have one of those? I had one of those Christmases, minus the underwear. The underwear would have been a great change of pace, actually. But I spent the rest of Christmas Day rearranging my sock drawer. This is no joke. Rearranging my sock drawer to fit all the socks. My mom denies it to this day, but I'm telling you, the little boy in me will never forget. Ever. 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 George Bernard Shaw said, "Wisdom is wasted on the youth." So are socks, okay? So are socks. Because guess what's on my Christmas list now? Socks, that's right. But I love a good pair of socks. My almost 49-year-old self just love socks, but not so much my 9-year-old self. That was a Christmas fail on my mom's part. I hope you're watching. Never forget. We've all got a Christmas story, right? And one of the stories we all relate to around Christmas is the waiting, right? When we were kids, just transport yourself back to when you were kids. The countdown was agonizing. It seemed slower than Christmas, and it just took forever. And as the gifts mounted under the tree, so did the anticipation and the intensity. I don't know if any of you did this, but when my parents would leave on occasion, I'd watch them drive down the road, and when it was clear, I'd grab a package out from under the tree and delicately open, undo the tape and slide it out just to see what was in it. Anybody else do that? Somebody gasped at me last hour. Go ahead. Don't judge me. But you know what the thing about packages is? It never goes back the way it came out, right? So it was just a poor job on my part, so I would just kind of toss it in the back under other stuff. But I don't know about you, I'm just terrible at waiting. I think most of us are just terrible at waiting. And now as adults, we're like, wait, Christmas is how many days away? 21, if you're counting. And a lot of people have gone from, I can't wait for Christmas to, I can't wait for Christmas to just be over. And no matter what camp you find yourself in, whether you're Clark Griswold or whether you're the Grinch, there is a date for that wait. There's a date on the calendar, right? It's coming. You know when it's coming. You know when it's over. I think waiting wouldn't be so bad if everything in life had a date on the calendar. If we could just look at the date on the calendar for when the marriage was going to get better, the waiting would be maybe less frustrating. If we had a date for when the health issue would be over, maybe the wait would be less disappointing. If we had a date for when our prodigal child would come back home, maybe the wait would be less discouraging. If you had a date for when you wouldn't feel like the grief is swallowing you whole, maybe the wait would be less agonizing. But we don't. And so we wait, and I think a wait without a date is the most painful kind of wait. We can't look at the calendar and see when it's going to be over. We can't look at the calendar and see when it's going to change. We can't look at the calendar and see when it's going to improve. And if you have a story like that, today, then you are in good company, because that's the story of a guy named Zechariah. He doesn't get much airtime in Scripture, but he's an important character in the Christmas narrative, and Luke, the gospel writer Luke, took the time to write his story down, and I think one of the reasons his story is in there is because we can all relate to this story. So Luke chapter 1, beginning in verse 5. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest of Abijah's division named Zechariah. His wife was from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both were righteous in God's sight, living without blame, according to all the commands and requirements of the Lord. Now, Zechariah was part of the priesthood of Israel. He performed the religious duties for the Jewish people. He was in charge of the regular ceremonies and festivals to honor the God of Israel, the same God who had promised a Messiah a millennia ago, and the same God who had now been silent for the last 400 years, silent through the rule of the Persians, silent through the rule of the Greeks, silent through the rule of the Romans. Israel had been occupied and ruled by 4 world powers, and God had promised to deliver a Messiah who would rescue them, who would save them, but he didn't give them a date. And so they waited. And every day there were faithful members of the priesthood like Zechariah who got up and performed their religious duties, hoping that today would be the day where everything changed. And generations of them died, clinging on to this unfulfilled hope. At what point do you just give up? 400 years is a long time. At what point do you just go, hey, I don't even know that God is still alive? At what point do you throw in the towel? I mean, is it today? Is it tomorrow? Is it next week? Is it next year? There will be times in your faith journey where God seems silent. There will be times in your faith journey where it seems like your prayers are falling on deaf ears. There will be times in your faith journey where you wonder if it's worth it anymore. And some of you may be there today. And I hope you're encouraged by this story today, because Zechariah and Elizabeth had no idea that their story would be told for the next 2,000 years. They had no incentive to get up every morning and live in this hopeful anticipation that today could be the day where everything changed. No incentive except for faithful obedience to a God they had never heard from, but still believed in. Verse 7 says, but they had no children because Elizabeth could not conceive, and both of them were well along in years. Now here's what we have in common with Zechariah and Elizabeth. Here's where our stories begin to merge together. They lived their lives by faith in the midst of pain. They lived their lives by faith in the midst of pain. They had never heard from God, ever. They had only heard stories about God's faithfulness, and so they lived in faithful obedience, trusting that the God they believed in still believed in them. They had given up on children. They were well along in years, but they hadn't given up on God. They lived their lives as if Christmas could come any day, as if God could break his silence at any moment. I don't know what kind of breakthrough you're waiting to happen in your life. Maybe you're waiting for a test result. Maybe you're waiting for an interview. Maybe you're waiting for a phone call. Maybe you're waiting for a long overdue apology. But here's what we learned from Zechariah and Elizabeth about the wait. When you're in a season of waiting, you just do the next right thing. You just do the next right thing. If that sounds simple, that's because it is. Following Jesus was not meant to be complex. In fact, Jesus came to break through the walls of complex religion just to make it simple. To take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Learn from me. My burden is easy, my yoke is light. You just do the next right thing. That's what we're called to do. If you're in a challenging job situation, like the next right thing, if you got something going on with your supervisor, the next right thing is not to go and complain to a coworker who can't do anything about it. The next right thing is just to do your job as though you were working for the Lord. That's what Paul says. Work as though you are working for the Lord, and you keep praying for wisdom, and you keep praying for discernment. If you're struggling with depression right now, the thing you want to do is isolate yourself. You just want to cut yourself off from people. That is the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is to lean in to community. Eugene Peterson, who wrote the Message version of the Bible, he wrote a lot of books, but he called the Christian life a long obedience in the same direction. A long obedience in the same direction. It's the title of one of his books. Like, it's just a series. The Christian life is just a series of taking the next right step every single day. It's just a series of taking the next right step every single day, regardless of our circumstances, a long obedience in the same direction, living without blame according to the commands of the Lord. So what does obedience look like in your life right now? If you don't know the answer to that question, you should ask your small group or ask a trusted friend who's also a Jesus follower. Zechariah and Elizabeth, they just kept showing up and doing the next right thing. It's simple. But it's not easy. That's why we need community. Because the right thing oftentimes is not the easy thing to do. And so you need people in your life who are encouraging you, who are challenging you, and when needed, who are correcting you. They're standing with you while you wait. Reminding you that when God seems silent, we stay faithful because He will speak. That when God seems unfair, we stay faithful because He is just. That when God seems distant, we stay faithful because we know He's near. So we just keep doing the next right thing. Zechariah and Elizabeth had no personal experience with God. All they had were stories of God's faithfulness in the past given to them through generations. And those stories were enough to keep them faithful and vigilant every single day, believing that God could show up any day. And so if God seems distant to you right now, if God seems silent to you right now, think about a time when He wasn't. Like, I want you to give that some thought this week if that's where you find yourself right now. Think about a time when God wasn't silent, when God was so clear to you, when God spoke to you, not audibly, but He spoke to you through a passage or through a message or through a song or through a friend. God is speaking all the time. God is not silent. Think about a time when God has spoken to you, when He revealed Himself to you, when He gave you a breakthrough and showed you some of His goodness, because there have been those times. And when we're waiting for God to do something now, it's easy to forget what God did then. So when God seems silent, it's important to reflect on the times where He wasn't, because history always tells the real story. And what we learn from history is that maybe God's not silent, maybe God's just waiting too. They prayed to have children. In that culture, if a woman could not get pregnant, they believed it was because God had removed His favor from her. It was His judgment on that individual. It was punishment for them. So Elizabeth lived with this social stigma that God had removed His favor, that His favor wasn't on her. But she didn't get bitter. She just continued to walk blamelessly before the Lord. She just got up every day and did the next right thing. Circumstantially, it doesn't look like they have anything to be hopeful for. They are way past childbearing years. Having children in that culture was a huge, huge deal. And yet they're childless. And God hasn't showed up, and God hasn't said a word. But despite the fact that life has been disappointing and that God has seemingly disappeared, they just stood vigilant every single day, as if any day could be the day that everything changed, and the waiting pays off. Verse 8, when his division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, it happened that He was chosen by Lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and burn incense. At the hour of incense, the whole assembly of the people was praying outside. Now, this was a big deal. It was an honor to be chosen to go into the temple and to perform this religious duty. There was a room inside the temple behind the curtain that was called the most holy place. And this is where the presence of God dwelled. And even though they had not heard from him in 400 years, they still believed that he was in there somewhere. And Zechariah goes in by himself, and everybody else is outside praying for him. And as he begins to burn the incense, he catches something out of the corner of his eye. An angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the altar of incense. And when Zechariah saw him, he was terrified and overcome with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, because your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John." Now, if an angel shows up to you, the first thing you want to hear is, "Don't be afraid." And the next thing you want to hear is, "Your prayer has been heard." Your prayer has been heard. I'm no angel. I know. But I got a message for you. Your prayer has been heard. Your prayer has been heard. Your prayer has been heard. Your prayer for your marriage has been heard. Your prayer for your health has been heard. Your prayer for your kids has been heard. Your prayer to have kids has been heard. God hears you. David wrote in Psalm 40, verse 1, he says, "I waited patiently for the Lord. I waited patiently for the Lord. And he turned to me and heard my cry for help." I waited patiently. God may be silent in your life right now, but that doesn't mean he's absent, and that doesn't mean he has not heard you. Your prayer has been heard. The angel says, "There will be joy and delight for you, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord and will never drink wine or beer. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit while still in his mother's womb. He will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the disobedient to the understanding of the righteous, to make ready for the Lord a prepared people." Now, if you've been around here for a while, you've heard my philosophy of prayer, that you keep praying until you change God's mind or until he changes yours. If you're willing to stay persistent in prayer, if you're willing to persevere in prayer, one of those two things will happen eventually. You will change God's mind, or God will change your mind, and that's when peace will come. So you just labor in prayer. I think they prayed like that for a child and didn't change God's mind, and they just kind of gave up on that prayer. I think they probably stopped praying that prayer in their 40s, maybe earlier. But God didn't give up on it. At what now seems like the most inopportune time, God answers that prayer. "Zechariah, you're going to have a son." And Zechariah, I think he responds like all of us would respond in that situation. How can I know this? How can I know this? I love when people say, if God would just open up the heavens and speak to me, like I would totally believe. I wouldn't have any doubts. I would know for sure. Zechariah was talking to an angel, and he's like, "What else you got? What else you got? How can I know this? For I'm an old man, and my wife is not old. She is well along in years." It's a wise old man. The angel answered him, "I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. I think he's got a tone. And he says, now listen, you will become silent and unable to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their proper time. Gabriel puts him in a timeout. And the Bible doesn't tell us what he was thinking, but I think, so I'm making this part up, but I think what he wanted to say, if he could have the ability to talk, is you mean we've been on God's calendar? You mean the answer to our prayer was not a no, but a not yet? You mean this was part of a plan? You mean there's a reason for our waiting? Have you considered the possibility that there might be a reason to your waiting? That maybe what you've interpreted as no is just not yet. I don't know what you're waiting on right now, but you have two options. We only have two options. When we're in this season of waiting, we can give up and walk away and just go, I'm done with it. Or we just stay faithful and do the right next thing. Those are the only two options. Option one will not accomplish anything in you or anything for you. Option two will transform you, because God never wastes a wait. God never wastes a wait. Trust that God's plan and perspective is bigger than yours, and wait for him to redeem your wait. There's a proper time. There's a proper time. And unfortunately, a lot of people, they don't stick around to see that proper time. They choose option number one, and they just walk away, and they waste the wait. And you probably know people like this. Every single person that's ever done that, they've not been better off for it. They haven't found more joy. They haven't found more peace. They haven't found more answers. All they found is more questions they didn't know they had. When we walk away, our waiting finds no redemption. But when we stay faithful, even in the confusion, when we live blamelessly before God, even in the pain, when we make it our objective to get up every day and be obedient and to live as if Christmas could come any day for us, what we will find is a God who has been there all along. And even if you never get what you were waiting for, what you did get was the presence of God, which is better than anything you wanted. It makes every wait worthwhile. See, Christmas reminds us that God did not walk away from us. Instead, he dressed himself in humanity. He put skin on. And he came to us so that he could walk with us. So while God may be silent right now in your life, he is not absent. He's working to bring all things together for our good. That's the promise that Paul lays down to us in Romans 8:28. Let's see how this story ends. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah, amazed that he stayed so long in the sanctuary. When he did come out, he couldn't speak to them. Then they realized that he had seen a vision in the sanctuary. He was making signs to them and remained speechless. When the days of his ministry were completed, he went back home. And after these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived and kept herself in seclusion for 5 months. And she said, "The Lord has done this for me. He has looked with favor in these days to take away my disgrace from the people." It's like God's favor has never left me. God's favor has always been on me. See, this is our story. Right? It's the story of waiting. And what we decide to do between the wait and the resolution. What do I do between the wait and the resolution? Do I stay faithful to God or do I walk away? Do I stay in that difficult marriage or do I give in to the advice of all these people around me who keep telling me, I just deserve to be happy? Do I keep my integrity in my job or do I make an adjustment to make the bottom line work so that I can keep my job? Do I keep serving others or do I just serve myself? Like, life is short, life is hard. What in the world am I waiting for? And the answer to that question is you're waiting for the Lord. You're waiting for redemption. And a redeemed wait is always worth the wait. Like their faithfulness gave birth to a son. And again, they could have just walked away a long time ago. God's not around anymore. God doesn't care about us. God's not speaking to us. Let's just be done with this. But they stayed faithful, and their faithfulness gave birth to a son. They named him John. He would grow up to become John the Baptist. And his role in God's story of redemption was to prepare the way for Jesus. And when you embrace the wait and you stay faithful to God, you do the same thing. You prepare the way of Jesus to do something in you that shapes you into the image of Jesus. And you prepare the way for Jesus to do something amazing through every person that is watching you wait. Because they are. You've claimed to be a Jesus follower. And so they're looking into your life to see the authenticity, to see if following Jesus makes any difference. They're watching you wait. They're watching you in your struggle. They're watching you in your pain to see what your God will show up and do. And what your God will show up and do depends on whether or not you're going to stay faithful. Because God will show up. And when you wait well, there is no better presentation of the gospel. As Israel was struggling through the Babylonian captivity, feeling totally and completely abandoned by God, God would send prophets to encourage them. And one of those prophets was Isaiah, and Isaiah wrote this to encourage the nation. He says, "He gives strength to the weary, and to the one who lacks might, he increases power. And though youths grow weary and tired, and vigorous young men stumble badly, yet those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. They will take the next right step and not become weary. They will just keep doing the next right thing and not become weary." Isaiah is pointing the nation toward the fulfillment of God's promise in Jesus. He's given them foresight. And their foresight is now our hindsight. Like we look back on the event where God broke through. And Christmas is our reminder that God keeps his promises even when it seems impossible. So live without blame before God. Walk in obedience and do the next right thing, even if it's the hard thing, even if you feel like walking a different way, because you will. The payoff is this: new strength, new strength, new strength will come. When you wait for the Lord, don't waste the wait. Let God redeem it. You cannot see it on your calendar, but it's marked on his. It's marked on his. And a day is coming where he will show his favor to you because he has heard your prayer. I'm going to pray for us, and we're going to take communion. And communion is that weekly reminder to us of God's faithfulness. Like if God seems silent to you right now, communion tells us the history of God's faithfulness. So if you need a packet, you can raise your hand. Our ushers will make sure you get one, but I'm going to pray for you and give you some time to take communion. Father, thank you for this season of Christmas. Thank you for the story that's been preserved for us, that's allowed us insight into the patience of a faithful couple who are but a footnote in the story of redemption. But more than that, God, it's a story of your faithfulness to them and to us. So thank you for stepping in to our mess, for showing up to us in our need, and for giving us yourself through your Son, Jesus. I pray in his name.